All right, what's going on, everybody? Welcome back to the Debrief podcast. I'm Josh Durso, joined by my co-host, Jackie Augustine. We are here virtually this week, talking all things policy and life across upstate New York. We do have a lot to get to. We've got some local stuff. We've got some state stuff. But Jackie, I think your Doing the Right Thing column from this past week is a great place to start. It ran on Tuesday, and you talked about outputs versus outcomes, and how sometimes local government just seems to get lost in the outputs rather than the outcomes. Talk to us a little bit about what inspired writing that column, but then what some of the things were that you were thinking of as you were writing it.
Okay. Yeah. So I saw that the city had released kind of a metrics dashboard for the end of the year and also is engaged in like a strategic planning operation, which I'm still trying to kind of figure out what that's about, apart from like updating the comp plan in some way. But the concern, and that I wanted to really touch on in the column, is that there is a big difference between outputs and outcomes, and the two certainly work together. But sometimes, whether it's because of like election sound bites or maybe just because it's easier to talk numbers, sometimes I think municipalities get really caught up in the targets that are quantitative and they don't necessarily contextualize those for what that means for their qualitative goals. So the example I gave in the column was like, if you say business recruitment, we want 8 new businesses in downtown. Well, I mean, in the context of what kind of downtown experience you're trying to create, what services or offerings you want for your residents, just creating 8 new businesses of any type could actually work against your long-term goals in terms of the retail experience, and whether it's tourist or resident focused. Sometimes just the addition of that number or aiming at that number at all costs will be kind of a setback or a rollback of your priorities qualitatively.
Yeah, it's interesting too, because when I read it, and then I thought about all the times you and I have talked about comprehensive planning and how important it is for communities to, just as a baseline, pay attention to their comp plan and use it as the guiding document that it is for their community. And how it sets the tone. Even you use the example here a couple times now, like if you have a goal of opening 8 new businesses in a certain part of town, if 5 of those businesses have closed after a couple of years, but you've also opened 8 new businesses, you're kind of losing track of, you're like muddying the waters of what progress actually like looks like versus what
Right.
it isn't. And it seems like a very like short-sighted way of governing. But at the same time, I feel like it's the way, frankly, most municipalities, especially the ones that we talk about all the time here in the Finger Lakes, I feel like it's the way they operate, right? Like, doesn't it feel like the standard way of operating for the most part?
Yes, unfortunately. And I think a lot of that is because there is this desire. I mean, we see it with like IDAs, right? Industrial development organizations. They want to say we created X number of full-time equivalent jobs.
Yeah.
Well, they don't discuss whether or not those jobs were the construction jobs for 6 months while a factory was being built, and then those jobs do not exist, or they go to a different project. There isn't this idea, or well, I mean, there is an idea, but it's not always followed through, of understanding like you and durable metrics. And, again, another example would be like police calls, right? Or police or fire calls. Well, if you're handling, 30,000 police calls in a year, how many of those are for unique incidents of the type that a police response is required? So, for example, if there is an accident, maybe 45 people call that accident in some way, or are somehow generating a call. So it doesn't necessarily mean that all 45 of those calls were unique calls for service. So I think it's like, I'm not anti numbers. I really do believe that measuring metrics is important, but the way that those metrics are actually structured, discussed and how deeply into the details you get makes all the difference in the world.
Yeah, it's interesting because again, so often, and we can talk about the strategic plan in Geneva that's getting some debate and discussion. It's kind of the same thing where the average person I think who was tuning into that meeting a couple nights ago in Geneva was probably asking themselves, okay, what's the difference between a strategic plan and a comprehensive plan? Right? There's that question, and then there's well, what are the goals? Is one sort of a short term thing and the other a long-term thing? Are they doing the same thing? If they are doing the same thing, then why do we have two of these things? Like, it raises a lot of questions on that front. And again, I go back to what we were just talking about, where you start to complicate the execution of your goals in municipal government, and what ends up happening is nothing, right? That's what I've seen happen so many times in so many different communities. And I guess we can just get right into it. You watched the meeting back from Geneva's
I
city
did.
council's most recent meeting. What was your takeaway? Most of the strategic plan discussion, from what I was able to gather, happened in the first chunk of the meeting, and there's going to be a public hearing or two for folks to, I guess, give their feedback to city council on what they would like out of it. What caught your eye?
Well, I do think it raises a lot of questions. I think what seems to be happening is there's still a learning curve, right? You've got a lot of new counselors, a new mayor. So I'm trying to be like generous and charitable in terms of not being too critical of what's happening. But, it is difficult to try to tease out sometimes what is actually being proposed because a comprehensive planning document is actually like a quasi judicial document. Like it actually does govern, it has very clear requirements of what it has to cover. It has to have public hearings, like actual legally required public hearings and a vote. And then everything a community does has to be aimed at implementing or being consistent with that comprehensive plan. So this strategic plan seems to take elements of the comprehensive plan and maybe make them more digestible or actionable. But it's not clear that some of the elements of the strategic plan are actually aligned with the comprehensive plan. So there's if you've seen some of the other council discussion that went into this prioritization, it's not clear that a lot of counselors are actually familiar with the comprehensive plan. I mean, there were some quite wild assertions made that somehow this is like a World Economic Forum document. I just, if there are a lot of interesting highlights from that meeting. The luck of the Irish was not with them that day for that St. Patrick's Day meeting because there was a bit of confusion. The comprehensive plan is very clear in saying this is what the community will do, will proceed with, will pursue, and here are the things it will not pursue because these things actually work against its long-term interests. And in the strategic plan, I think there's a bit of a return to some of those things that Geneva was cautioned against. Again, nobody's against single family home ownership, but putting a lot of resources into single family home ownership promotion to the, I guess I would say not totally to the exclusion, but then failing to look at the actual market realities of why people are or are not pursuing single family home ownership seems to be an allocation of resources that is not wholly aligned with the best practices. So there are just parts of this strategic plan that seem like issues that have been on the mind of some of these elected officials for a while, but may not necessarily have been vetted against the economic realities and the actual public policy data that would drive good decisions. So, I worry that Geneva potentially could fall behind the curve again by reverting back to old strategies that other communities understand do not work. So that's my concern. There's a let's do something and that's great, but the something still needs to be well informed. I don't doubt that it's well intentioned, but it needs to be well researched and well informed because the city doesn't have extra money to spend, I guess the quickest way to say it. So those resources really need to be deployed strategically, and there's not a lot of time or money to just throw around in a really scattershot approach because someone has a gut feeling that we ought to try this or that. Like it's really time to say, really, like, put up the evidence or we're not going to pursue this.
Yeah. So I guess I had like a few thoughts as I was looking back at it and then just trying to parse everything out. The first question that came to mind was, is there that much of a difference in opinion among city council that this extra strategic planning process is actually necessary? And I couldn't come up with a good answer on that one. And that's a judgment call, right? But then I just started thinking about, like, another plan is another plan. Like, at some point the rubber has to meet the road, and
Mhm.
you know at some point there has to be something actionable. There has to be something that's actually executed, done, completed. And whenever communities are going through these planning processes, I always think, like, you know I don't know that another plan is necessarily what a city like Geneva needs. Geneva needs to figure out how to actually get things done and then
Right.
start to do things. Because I kind of feel like I see or know where this is going to go. Strategic plan gets adopted. Perhaps a comp plan is the comp plan is reworked out in some way, shape, or form. But we fast forward a year or 2 or 3 years or however long you want to go. Everyone's going to be looking around saying, "Well, did anything really happen? Like, are any of the," and you were just talking about, outcomes versus just outputs. Like, this is another good example of that. Like, what outcomes will we have actually seen that are different because the city went through this process versus had it not gone through this process and just picked a few things to focus on and just focused on them if they were able to.
Yes. Yeah, I mean, I think that's the $1,000,000, or I guess since we're talking about a municipality, the multi-million-dollar question, right? Is to be seen. We have been ready to implement the comprehensive plan for a decade. And some pieces of it have been done, and there's been great progress. Other pieces of it have been stalled, and there's been no progress. So, to your point, how does the strategic plan get us more strategically ready to act than the strategic plan that is the comprehensive plan that we've been trying to get action on, in the interim? And I think it does get back to this question that you were asking. Sorry, as my dog is at my elbow trying to get me to play catch. Think that it does kind of beg the question that you were saying is, where's the disconnect? What is it that's in the comprehensive plan that has made this current council say, hold on, we don't want this? And that was sad last night that, oh, everybody I'm hearing doesn't want this. And I can't figure out what the this is that they're opposed to, because the strategic plan actually that they seem to endorse is just a repeat of a lot of this. So it's a little confusing to me. And I think it does speak to the fact that I'm not convinced from what I've seen that the majority of council has spent time understanding, reading, asking questions about, interrogating, really involved with the comprehensive plan. I think they have talked to people about it, and I think they may or may not be getting correct information about what's in it, but I don't know that they've gone directly to the source and spent time with it, because otherwise I don't think they would say they are disagreeing with things that they actually don't disagree with.
Yeah, and just to kind of further the point, or I guess etch in the point that I was making a little clearer for people who are listening. I'm not knocking the process. No, I'm not knocking the doing your due diligence is important. But I think when I say when the rubber meets the road, this is where you risk losing the public, because the public doesn't really understand this process, right? They don't really understand what the difference is between a strategic plan and a comprehensive plan, even if there's just a comprehensive plan. Judging by my recent interactions with folks who have been writing in about assessments, which we'll talk about later, I'm not sure there's much in local municipal government that the average taxpayer genuinely understands. And I don't mean to criticize anybody. I just think it's very complicated stuff that the average
Right.
person does not have time to think about. At the end of the day, they just want to see their community improving and going the right direction. And I'm not sure how any of this gets any community closer to that when you're just from the outside, it feels like at best you're just repeating steps, going through the same things over and over again, and not really actually doing anything specific that someone can point to and be like, "Oh yeah, that happened. Cool." You know?
Yes, and I'm with you that this is complex, and I also don't mean to be knocking anybody, including the current counselors, for taking their time to get up to speed on it and for not immediately having all the answers. But I would just point out that as elected officials, I mean, they do have an enhanced responsibility to get themselves to the point of being familiar with this and having those answers. So, yeah.
Yeah. Hey, we'll see. Next up, we have to talk about the climate debate that's been happening in Albany. I've actually been anxious to talk to you about this one because it seems like every day there's a new kind of angle or twist. But here's where we are right now. All signs point to Governor Kathy Hochul making a big move backwards, or what she's going to probably call a compromise on the state's climate and energy goals. Not totally clear what that's going to be. I was actually just before we came on here doing some searching to see if she had announced anything or anything like that, and I hadn't seen anything. But odds are it's going to be some kind of concession to the middle or the right side of politics here in New York State. But that's been met with a lot of resistance from the progressive flank of her party. It's shaping up to probably be in what looked like initially a pretty uneventful budget cycle for Albany standards. This is looking to be the big thing. So I guess just to start to sort of level set this thing, what do you make of the governor's position? And should the state be changing course on its climate goals from your vantage point?
What I make of this situation is that once again, the residents of the state are being literally and figuratively left in the dark about what's actually driving this climate debate. Because I think the governor is responding to pressure largely from our area, from upstate, about problems with utility bills, electrical supply, a variety of kind of utility concerns. But a lot of that is being driven by the interests that stand to gain an awful lot of money by participating in siting of new large load users like data centers, nuclear power, things where the traditional, regardless of what your political affiliation is, the traditional players in economic development see that there are some deals to be made if people will tolerate certain things. And I think that our electrical supply and utility supply issues are being wrapped into this blame climate goals when really it's a failure to talk about holding the private energy providers to actual upgrade standards, transmission line improvements, to actually understand that these data centers and these large load users are actually stressing the system in a way that residential users are making up the difference for. And I think somehow the people that are in the mix of this discussion have found a way to kind of manipulate the debate in a way that is pitting residents against their own long-term environmental interests, right? Like I believe firmly that the climate law is protective of the people who stand to lose the most, namely the upstate communities that are having their fresh water, their fresh air, and their enjoyment of their property taken over by polluting industries. And I think that, again, it's just this weird, there's a lot of financial interests involved. And the governor, because it's an election year, I think is capitulating to those and trying to appease everybody while the residents end up kind of holding the bag one way or the other.
Okay, so from a theoretical standpoint, I agree with that analysis, but is it not at least partially driven by the fact that the state has been pretty slow to roll out as much green energy as if it were going to hit the goals that it had planned to hit or wanted to hit. Wouldn't we have needed to see more the state move more aggressively in executing? Because this again feels to me like one of those scenarios where really like there is that political back and forth, the grid discussion and utilities obviously have not been held accountable and they've been allowed to just sort of coast for 20 years more or
Mhm.
less. And of course like we're in a bad spot now with that. A lot of upstate communities are in kind of like a maxed out situation with the grid. There isn't really room for much of anything. But even still, like it's almost as if the state's just been kind of like, and I guess Hochul deserves the blame for it, I suppose, since Democrats have control over all parts of government in New York
Mhm.
State. And yet, we're looking at this situation where just year after year they'd been kicking the can, or they had been kicking the can down the road and not executing. And now, you know, I almost feel like the state has to change course on its goals because I'm not sure any of them are actually achievable. And I think it's I think it's at least within the time frame that was originally proposed, which, is part of the whole urgency deal. Like it's important.
Right. Yeah, I don't disagree with you on that. And I guess I would say, yes, I do believe that the blame lies at the feet of the people who control the state legislature and governor's mansion, right? However, I would also point out, though, that there have been some regulatory slowdowns that are coming from the federal level as well, like the back and forth about will they, won't they, about the wind power, the kind of downstate projects that were originally greenlit and then paused and then back up again. So, I will say I do think there was an effort to put projects in the pipeline that would, the proverbial pipeline, that would help to meet some of the energy production, the renewable energy production goals. But again, to then pivot and say that the reason we need an adjustment is because of rising cost I think is a false narrative. The costs are rising not because the strategy for renewables was a bad strategy, but because pursuing renewables without pursuing private investment in the existing grid and existing providers and traditional forms of energy have just been allowed to run roughshod and spike up prices across the board. So I just feel like the messaging, like the strategy is probably right at this point, but the messaging feels wrong.
Okay, so another question then that just popped into my head is, does this feel then like a matter of maybe the state bit off too much, bit off more than it could chew in one shot in terms of like should it have been chunked up a little bit more so that a step-by-step process, I guess? Because you're right, like as you were talking about that, I was thinking about how the electric school bus mandate, which
Hmm.
is also getting a ton of play right now,
Right, right.
is also, like, really intricate to this because, obviously, if you converted every school district in Upstate New York to, electric buses, the demand that alone is going to put on the grid that is already maxed out in a lot of communities. I mean, we may not have the power to do that yet, but, again, that's another piece of this. It's like you kept layering on new and more policies, and as well-intended and good as they may have been, you also weren't acting on the state wasn't acting on and executing the previous ones. So it just
Right.
kind of it feels like this thing that's now like, you haven't organized or cleaned your desk in months. And you sit down and you think you know where everything is, and all of a sudden you're looking for somebody calls and they're like, "Hey, do you have that letter?" I'm like, "Yeah, I just saw it last week." And you have no idea where it is. I feel like that's sort of the state right now with green energy anything. Like, there's a million policies, there's a million ideas, by their own measure, they're good, right? But from an execution standpoint, they're like, none of it's in front of the state. Like, none of it's there to be grabbed or like, moved on, right?
Yeah, and that example certainly speaks to me. My goodness, because my desk is a mess. But yeah, I think you're right, and I would say, in full defense of the policies, like these are the moves that New York State needs to make. Like
Yeah.
there are climate impacts that are going to disproportionately impact communities that are already most vulnerable. Those changes need to be made. However, the state cannot do it alone. It has to have buy in from private industry. And part of that has to be a stick approach. It can't all be carrots. And I think that what we're seeing now is what happens when you have a policy of appeasement of the private sector as opposed to actually holding people's feet to the fire and saying the system you're running that you're profiting on is not providing the value to the residents that we expect. And here are the changes that need to be made. And that, for some reason, there is still not a political appetite to take that route and to close that loop to make sure that the full agenda actually could work.
Yeah. Yeah. Who knew when it comes to energy policy that at some point you're going to have to hold the privately held utilities to account? Crazy how that works. All right.
They should have asked us.
Yeah. Yeah. It would have been that easy. Let's talk housing. A couple weeks ago on Substack, I wrote about the senior housing trap and how it's setting some communities back. Now, I want to be clear. I wasn't saying then, and I'm not saying now that senior housing as an idea is bad. I just wanted to debunk this thing that I kept hearing locally. It sounds a little bit like this. We just need more senior housing. And if we build some more of it, that's going to cause turnover in the real estate market, and that's going to unlock it for young families. And all of a sudden, young families are going to be able to, local young families are going to be able to buy houses and afford houses. And it's going to jumpstart everything. I've heard it dozens of times. And on the surface, it sounds like an easy fix to an otherwise really like complicated problem. And it's a really comfortable answer for communities that are shrinking and skewing older by the day. But it just doesn't match with reality. So I was doing some digging when I was getting ready to write it, and one of the things I found was a Pew survey from last year where it found 93% of seniors say they plan to stay put in their homes, and this was a survey of people 65 and older, and a little less than 6% of them actually move each year in the best case scenario, and that's according to census data. So with those numbers, and then given the context of our regional housing supply being completely behind the eight ball in terms of housing stock, this is just not a viable path. You need more of everything, right? Like you need more multifamily, you need more single family, you need more senior, you need more low, you need more middle market, you need literally more of everything. And a couple of the people who responded to that column, they asked, well, what can we do? What can we do? And the thing that I wanted to follow up on, the reason why I wanted to talk about it was just show up to the meeting, right?
Right.
Like
Right.
the one thing that drives me absolutely insane, and I've been on zoning and planning boards before, so I've seen it myself. The only people who show up when there is a proposal, for the most part, are people who are opposed to whatever the proposal is. People who are in support of it never show up. So
Hmm.
if you know this is a problem, if you know housing is a problem and you look around your community and you're concerned, maybe it's because your kids or your grandkids can't afford to buy a home, or maybe you just look around and you realize that, all your neighbors are starting to get older and you don't really know what that's going to mean for your local fire department, your local EMS, or whatever, your school district. Show up to the meeting and say you support it, because there's this unfortunate reality, especially on planning boards, where a few people, less than a dozen people can show up to a planning board meeting. And no matter how big the community is or isn't, if everything the planning board hears is no, 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 and we don't want this, and we have X, Y, and Z concerns, there's a fair chance that they're going to, at minimum, hit the brakes. The only way you combat that is with support. And unfortunately, I know people are busy and it's hard to make it out to meetings that are at 6:30, 7 o'clock, especially if you have a family. If you care about these things, I think it's sort of on everyone to do it, to show up. Yeah. I was actually curious what you like when you hear that question, what can I do? What comes to your mind?
Well, I wanna say first that your column, your article was very good, and this I do think, again, the idea that there will just be this housing churn, that all we need to do is stir it up and get people moving, and that fixes the problem, is definitely a limited view that again, doesn't touch with reality, as you pointed out. So to that end, when people are trying to figure out what they can do, I don't expect everybody in a community to become a public policy expert, right? I don't expect everybody to go to Pew or to go to Brookings or to go to Aspen, the Aspen Institute, not physically Aspen, right? And start reading about best practices. But I do expect that people would have some curiosity about what might work and maybe some honesty about the fact that what we've been doing so far has not worked. So, I know definition of insanity, doing the same thing over and over and expecting different results. We're really stuck there, right? Like we have some insane policy stuff because we're not like I think the best thing residents of our region could do is be willing to admit that maybe our intuition is wrong about certain things. So I have often approached a topic and thought, oh, I know what would make this better. And unless you are willing to check that and then when presented with alternative evidence say, you know what, like my gut was wrong about that, I actually hadn't considered X, Y, and Z, and now I need to modify. I think that's where we are right now. Everybody wants to be kind of like an armchair economic developer, and we don't really want to humble ourselves enough and say, you know what? Like we're facing some unique circumstances that need new strategies. And how can we find other communities that have similar constraints who are figuring this out? And if you look at other communities that are having success, it seems to be that the missing piece the missing piece for us, but the thing that moved them forward was a willingness of residents to say, tell me more about this. Like, what's going on? Like, to have an actual honest conversation. So, when you say come out and support stuff, I agree, because if a plan has been made and there is evidence that this new approach will work, it is important that people give their elected officials the political capital, the support to say, we're going to try something, we're going to go in this direction. Because otherwise, we get into this very kind of combative mode. And I guess going back to that city council meeting that they had Tuesday night, I mean, one of the counselors said, I was sent here to fight. And I thought, okay, how are you going to finish that sentence? You were sent here to fight for something? No, it was, I'm here to fight against this stuff. And it's like, okay, we need more people trying to figure out what we're fighting for and who want to really effectively like work for some changes. And when it comes to housing, people can't figure out why single family home ownership is not the panacea of economic development it used to be. We had blind spots about out of town investment through LLCs, through Airbnb, through, kind of private equity, which we thought, oh, that happens in cities that aren't ours. Just being caught unaware by certain trends and then not recognizing that when somebody moves out of their house that they've lived in for 35 years, there's a lot of deferred maintenance sometimes in that house that a young homeowner does not want to take on. That's not what they're looking for. So simply having a homeownership program to get younger families into the houses that older residents have moved out of might not do what people are thinking it's going to do. So sorry, that was a long way of saying being open to A, confronting reality, B, being curious about what might respond to that new reality. And then C, a willingness to try something new is what I would ask of people.
Yeah, and I think just piggybacking off of that scenario you just described with deferred maintenance, we're already operating from a deficit where most people are just priced out of the market to begin with.
Hmm.
They can't even play ball. So they can't even get to that point of being able to, as you say, take on those ungodly expenses that come after that. But I just think of, and I can think of like a half dozen in our, between Rochester, Syracuse, and Ithaca, I can think of about a half dozen senior housing projects where they'll happen in different communities. They're the typical 40, 50, 60, 70-ish unit developments. They look like what most people would expect them to look like. And one gets approved and everybody around goes, yeah, we did it. And then, that's just kind of it. And what happens is it gets built and it's great. And, it gets filled, but what it gets filled with aren't just people who live right there, who live in that community. It's getting filled with people who live outside the zip code where it's built. And then you have like, it's almost like you're importing more of the problem. Not saying that more seniors living in a community are a problem, but it's just kind of working in that goal of turning the housing market because you have that reality that most people, a lot of younger people are, just priced out of the market. And then the reality that, these units are filling with, a mishmash of people, some who live locally, some who don't. Um, and then you have the reality that, 93% of people over the age of 65 say they plan to just stay put. So senior housing first as a means of digging yourself out of the housing crisis that we now face, it ain't it. And, to your point, I think there's a lot of reflection that has to happen, but also a theme in today's episode, I think, is there's just got to be more do, more go, got to build more, period.
And
Any and all.
it has to be connected to the actual demand and not the perception of what will work. Or worse yet, the developer's profit, right? Because a developer might say, well, I can stack the following incentives and deliver you this type of housing. And a community might, again, if going back to our first question, if the metric, if the output is all that matters, oh, we're going to create 150 new housing units, they hang their hat on that and say, we've got a developer willing to do that. Well, you need to know outcome wise, are those 150 housing units actually meeting a demand that you have and moving you where you want to be? Or is this just output? I don't mean to say that we don't need a lot more housing because we certainly do, right? We know, like you said, we're way behind the eight ball in terms of keeping up with just housing demand. But if it's not of the right type, it may not get filled. It might not actually meet any sliver of the market that you were actually thinking you had to address. So I think that that is an additional concern.
Yeah, definitely. It definitely is. Although I would just say, from my vantage point, I think I've seen so little building in the Finger Lakes as a whole that pick your zip code. I think you could build just about anything and it would fill because
Yes,
there
I
is
think
such
that's
a
true.
demand.
I think
Um,
that's true.
but to your point, communities need to be intentional and they need to look at their community and be honest about what their community is actually made up of. Like there's this rose-colored glasses view of what communities look like today versus what they looked like 40 years ago. And it's really frustrating because it creates a lot of gaps to your point in the housing market. All right. Anyway, let's stay within the housing theme and let's get into assessments. So last week, I was scrolling through Facebook and I was seeing a bunch of posts from people who live in Macedon complaining about their assessments. And as I was scrolling and reading, started to see an unbelievable amount of misinformation. I wound up writing a Substack about it, mainly just from the point of frustration, not just that people don't understand the assessment process still. Right? Like, we know that. Every spring, people complain about their assessments. They don't like seeing the big number. It's a confusing, weird, most definitely imperfect process. But the thing that I was saying, we had gone so far beyond the standard, like, they're just trying to rip me off. And we were full we were all the way into, like, the stuff that I thought was reserved for bots. Like, we're talking, like, you know, more money for
Assessment
illegal
conspiracy theory.
crazy, like things that went all the way up to like national level politics, like the crap we see there, like paying for so and so local elected's new car, or it's political revenge by the assessor. They
Right.
they have it out for certain people, or this town supervisor is looking for this, or it's more money for illegals, like all of these crazy things that are just so far beyond the pale. It is the most boring, like I said, it's an imperfect process, but it is such a boring process. Anyone can get the data. Anyone can challenge their assessment, but it just so far missed the mark. And you probably think I'm crazy for being surprised at any of this, but I was kind of surprised. I was surprised that we had gone that far down the rabbit hole.
Yeah, no, I'm also surprised because it again, I think part of it is I'd like to think that we keep talking about it, so hopefully people are learning more about it and they're therefore are less scared of it, right? Because the more you know, the less scary hopefully it appears. But it's just it does to me make me concerned about the quality of governing in the region because it ultimately is the responsibility of elected officials to give accurate, useful information to their constituents. I mean, that's why we have representative government, right? If every resident had to be an expert in municipal policy on their own, we should just have direct delegates. Like we should just have a big town hall meeting and everybody votes, right? The whole idea of having representative government is that you send people in your stead who can spend time and make it their job to learn the right stuff and then communicate that out. But oh my goodness, I mean, attend some town hall meetings, and people, some elected officials are just as misinformed about the assessment process as the residents are, and then it perpetuates this misinformation. So I think, the first thing that people need to hear loud and clear is that your assessment and your tax bill are two different things. They they bear a relationship to one another, but they are not identical. While you want your assessment to go up because that means your house is worth more, you have more equity, you have more borrowing power, you have more net assets, right? I understand people don't want their taxes to rise at the same rate, but the process by which that happens is different and does not lie in the assessor's hands. But I think people want to take all their anger out on the assessor and give their elected officials who are doing the budgeting, who actually are determining the tax rate, a pass in all this. It seems very odd.
Yeah, I mean, I'm chuckling right now to myself because I just opened up my email and like 10 minutes before we started recording here, I got an email from a person in another community who is absolutely incensed that their assessment increased 33%. Um, it's one of those things, like, that is a direct reflection of the housing market, man. Like, that is just like, sorry, houses are worth a lot more than they were just a couple years ago or 4 years ago or 5 years ago. And assessments don't happen. Properties are not reassessed every year. They're reassessed every couple, 3 years, 4 years. Some communities kick the can down the road as long as they possibly can. And there's a whole process that governs that as well. But just, to me, there was that disconnect, which to me felt like the biggest disconnect in reading you had people in these comments saying that, the housing market is terrible. Houses aren't selling for anything anymore. Like it's a completely different world than it was a couple years ago. And houses are sitting on the market for, you know, 2, 3, 4 months. So I just went to realtor.com and I just typed in Macedon and there were like 12 houses for sale, like in the entire town of Macedon, which is just an extraordinarily silly low number of units to have on the market at any given time, even the winter. But the other thing here is like, this isn't an assessment process problem as much as it is, I think, a system could be better problem. So, one, you've got the whole idea that the assessment process, I suppose, could be better. If we were going to like do that a different way, okay. But the lack of education on civic related topics at the local level, so people have a better understanding, is definitely a problem. And that's been going on for as long as I've been alive. So 35 years. People not feeling connected to the services they receive for the property taxes they pay is another big problem. Like the average person does not feel it. And then to me, the third piece of it is like a complete desperation around feeling in control of like one's personal finances. Like when I read and I see the things people say when they are freaking out because their assessment went up and they think their property tax bill is going to go up 10, 15, 20, 30%, even though that's not the case. Like to me, it very much just looks like people who are just they're at their breaking point when it comes to being able to afford their life, the world around them. And that's not a knock on anyone who's experiencing that. That is just literally like, I think the context of the world we live in right now, the moment we live in is that. And, I think those last three things that I mentioned are kind of the overriding forces that are driving this like misinformation. I don't want to call it a misinformation campaign because it's not even really that organized. It's just literally like all of the splattering of all of the things onto Facebook, just people venting into the void just to just get their frustrations out, I guess.
I was just about to say it is frustration. It's this pent up frustration and confusion and feeling that they're unsure how to be effective in doing something about it. And I do think all the things that you just said, right? What are people getting as a return on their investment for the tax dollars that they're paying? The disconnect for not understanding the process. And again, I really feel like that goes back to this fundamental question of quality of elected officials. Because if you are a resident of a community and you don't understand how your government is working, there is somebody you have hired to have this figured out and to make you feel at ease about it. And that is your elected official. And your elected officials do need to develop some expertise in the methods and means of local government so that they can assure you that those things that are happening are in your best interest, that your interests and needs are being taken into account. Now, granted, I mean, I'm not trying to say that elected officials need to please everybody. A, you can't.
Oh
B,
yeah.
some people are wrong, right? You don't want to,
Yeah.
you want to make sure you're doing the right stuff. And, no offense to anybody in particular, but we're not 100% right 100% of the time. So
Nope.
you need somebody who's able to kind of course correct in that way. But I do feel like when you see these online venting sessions, frustration sessions, I see that as a symptom of a local government that's not in communication with the people, a local government that needs more skills. And that is cause of concern for me because I think sometimes there's not as much participation in local elections as I would like. There's not as much vetting of candidates that I think is needed. People pay a ton of attention to what's going on at the national level and even on the state level. but your local elected officials are like where your pocketbook lays, you know? And yet that's the area that seems to get the least amount of engagement and attention. So maybe these assessments are a wake up call to people not to go storm the assessor's office. Please don't do that,
Yeah, no.
but to start paying attention to town board meetings, city council meetings, and ask yourself, are the people that are sitting in these seats knowledgeable, competent advocates for the public interest? Or are they people who are confused but very good at kind of blowing smoke? Or, uh, you know, just maybe not doing the job, not engaged enough. And I think as we see that start to change, people will start to feel more trust, more understanding, less frustration with these processes. Because I think, you know, it's hard if you turn on a meeting and watch, and I'm not picking on Geneva here. This applies across the board. You can go to Auburn, you go to Canandaigua, you can look at Seneca Falls. When you see elected officials expressing frustration about assessments and not able to appropriately, accurately convey what the process is, that is cause for concern to me, because that fuels suspicion and skepticism, and it is disinformation. I'm not saying it's a coordinated disinformation campaign, but I think, it does give me pause when you sometimes hear people, again, whose job it is to know the right thing, not able to speak intelligently about what's actually happening, and not able to give people the tools to respond and understand what's actually hitting their mailbox, their wallet, their kitchen table. And then, and bad information has a way of spreading quite quickly and is difficult to counter. So I think people see, I mean, in my case, my assessment has gone up. My house value has doubled despite me not doing anything that would warrant it, in terms of improvements to my house.
Yeah.
But I understand what the process is, so I don't get angry about it. I just think, oh, I better pay closer attention then to what the next budget's going to be, because I don't want this assessment to then be coupled with a tax rate that grows at a similar rate, because then I know what the consequence of that is going to be in terms of a tax bill.
Yeah, and I think part of the issue too is a lot of elected officials fall into one of two camps, which is either insulated from the problem or susceptible slash experiencing the problem, right? And in this case, the problem is increasing tax burden, property tax burden. I'm not so sure that you can be an effective teacher of the ways and how it works if you fall into either of those camps, right? Because in one of those scenarios, you it doesn't really matter. You're not affected by it one way or another. You're comfortable enough that you can absorb whatever the change may be, up, down, left, right, whatever. But if you're susceptible to it or you're experiencing it yourself, I think that's, also an isolator, because then, you're worried just like the residents are. And it kind of keys into what you were saying there with about elected officials in general. So that's just kind of like a last observation that I had there. But it's just one of those things. No matter how many resources are out there for people to look at, evaluate, try to understand the assessment process, this is just it seems like just an annual tradition. I'm not even sure how many people of those who gripe and complain on social media about their assessment price actually follow through on appealing. Really, I really don't know.
Yeah, I don't know either. And I do think, it makes a difference. I think that if you think about people who are upset about their assessment, going back to what you were saying before about people staying in their homes for the long term, if you're staying in your home and you have no interest in or look toward selling at some time, your approach to your assessment is just fundamentally different.
Yeah.
And I think if you're talking about a community where people tend to stay in a house that was underassessed at the beginning and is experiencing these pressures, these upward pressures from houses in the neighborhood selling, I mean, it makes sense. It's disorienting and scary to people. But again, a good explanation of it could, I think, quell some of that fear.
It'll do it for this episode of the show. If you're looking for more, Jackie's Doing the Right Thing runs bi-weekly on Tuesdays in the Finger Lakes Times, and my column in Focus is published in the weekend edition of the paper, as well as over on Substack. If you want to get in touch with the show, the email address is debrief@fingerlakes1.com. And we have a new YouTube channel, so hit the subscribe button there if you are listening to us there. And of course, Jackie mentioned her 2-minute drills. More of those coming very, very soon. So watch for those as well. Have a great weekend, everyone. We'll see you next time.